Sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Part 3. We've made it.
Saving the best for last.
I hope not. Or I hope so.
So you said that the term rock and roll is actually a slang term for...
Rock and roll, as I understand it, is a slang term for
Having
sex. So all the rock and roll, everything you've been turned on to this point, which I keep going back to that primal energy you feel when you listen to rock and roll. That is all about hardcore fucking and has been since the genesis of rock and roll. That's what it's about. That's the whole point. Every time I was practicing my guitar, anytime I watched the videos on MTV, anytime I wrote a song, there was something at the root of it all. Good old-fashioned sex.
Yep.
Good old-fashioned whoopee.
When you're talking about rhythm and blues, which was essentially, and blues before rock and roll.
Yeah.
A lot of what they were singing about was sex.
Yeah.
And maybe they were using a lot of innuendos. Mm-hmm. And then now that we're talking about this, it makes me think that it's like there was someone rock and roll. You know, they talk about Elvis, and it was like, oh, we can bring the black music for the white kids. You know, obviously there was racism and stuff like that.
Oh yeah.
But then, now I think about it, do you think it was more about like the topic, the topic itself? The reason why there was this fear of rock and roll wasn't because it was black music. It was because they're singing about fucking.
Well, yeah, I mean, that goes back. They're singing about that, and not to mention, Elvis, when he was on Ed Sullivan, they had to block out because he shook his hips, and back then, that was really taboo. I mean, the shaking of the hips. Oh, we'll have none of that.
Do you want to?
We want to hear more shaboom, shaboom, sha-la-la-la-la-la-la-la-la, shaboom. We can't have any hip shaking.
You know what though? You know the truth of that though.
What's that?
That whole thing that you're talking about, that they could only film Elvis from the waist up. That was completely contrived.
Contrived. Okay. So
it's completely contrived by Colonel Tom Parker.
Right.
Where he said to them, he created that scandal.
Oh, okay.
Artificially.
So it's fake.
Make it like it's like a rule that.
So they did that in the Doors movie too, where I remember the original Ed Sullivan of the Doors, and at no point do they zoom in on Jim Morrison's crotch or do anything remotely close to that.
Yeah.
You just are watching the Doors sing "Light My Fire." But in the movie, they make it look like he's got this big raging hard-on in his leather pants, and some cameraman said, "That's what we need." And it was a big scandal, and I don't think that ever happened. I think that was bullshit. But no.
But you know what, though? Coming into the whole sex and rock and roll connection, when I first think of it, immediately my mind goes to the 80s. And I think about all the hair metal bands.
Right. And
all the hard rock bands. And almost all the bands are singing about getting laid.
Yeah. Because I think the 80s...
It's all about the chicks. And in all the videos, there'd be the hot girls.
Every damn one.
And every one. But at the beginning, when you're talking about Elvis or the Beatles or all these bands, it was the girls that were going crazy for the rock stars.
Right.
So the sex appeal switched. At first, the sex appeal was for the girls being like, oh, Elvis. So when you get to like, even Led Zeppelin, like Robert Plant, a lot of women thought he was very, very attractive.
I think the 80s was
the
probably like, it was because the 80s were decadent. And I think that was like the celebration. Because since then, you haven't really seen it. It kind of moved into the hip-hop world and country.
Yep.
You don't really see it with rock music. You don't see them objectifying women the way they did in the 80s.
And
I don't... a lot of people think, oh, they're objectifying women. I honestly think they were celebrating them. It was just like, these are gorgeous women. this is why we're doing this in the first place. The majority, in general, music, hot women, that's part of the program, but it got a lot of slack in the 80s because a lot of it was considered objectifying, when I always looked at it as like, no, they're celebrating these gorgeous women and they're part of rock and roll. They are part of this whole world that we live in.
Oh my God! I mean, that was something. That
Whether they're in the audience or up on stage.
Why do you start a band? Why would a young man want to start a band to get laid?
No, I started a band because I was really interested in the retirement plan.
The retirement plan.
I heard there was a lot of benefits when you play music.
Yeah, there's a pension.
I'd watch MTV, and I'd have to sit through Rick Astley, Paula Abdul, but then Motley Crue's Wild Side would come on. And I freaking love that song. And I would sit there with a tennis racket because I didn't know how to play guitar yet. So I'm just strumming a tennis racket playing Wild Side.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking of the girls that I have crushes on at school and how cool they would think I am if I played
strumming your tennis
strumming
racket.
my tennis racket and just singing Wild Side. They would want to marry me.
I need another pick.
Hey, I want to show you this song I learned on my tennis racket. It's called Wild Side by Motley Crue.
I'm a musician.
Home girl.
Let's see your guitar collection. Well, no, I have a series of
Golf club. I have a series
Look
of
at
golf
this.
clubs.
This is Spalding.
I use these rulers for drumsticks on my Trapper Keeper. I did. I would play Def Leppard's Hysteria. True story. Loved the album Hysteria. Loved it so much that one day the cassette got eaten and I was so distraught I buried it and had a funeral for it. True story. Has nothing to do with sex.
Well, actually, it does, because Def Leppard, they were sex.
Hell yeah, they were. Talk about
chicks love when they
were like the chick metal band.
And when they put out Hysteria,
it was Hysteria.
That's when the girls really got it.
Oh, it was insane. I remember about that album.
I mean, put things in perspective. I mean, it's like, I remember at that time, you had Def Leppard, the big bands, hard rock bands, was Def Leppard, Quiet Riot, and Twisted Sister. And the only good-looking band out of all of them was Def Leppard. All this is making me think about metal. And how, like, when it comes to, like, metal music.
Right.
That the bands may be talking about something, but they're not really talking about sex. Because when I think about Black Sabbath or Priest or Maiden or any of the thrash bands that I was into in the 80s, they were talking about anything else but sex.
Yeah, and that goes back to what we were talking about earlier about being good songwriters.
And I think when you get to the grunge of the 90s, because again, they weren't really singing about sex anymore.
No, it was kind of over.
Yeah. It was almost passé. I mean, obviously, the reason I think
the 90s in general was kind of a big sex drought.
Well, I think
that was supposed to be my prime.
Well, I think it was like a wake. It was just sort
I
of
got ripped off.
I think like the 80s hard rock stuff
90s.
was kind of it ran its course and it became ridiculous, and the whole grunge thing just kind of killed it.
Yeah, that's what happened with.
But along with it, you lost all the stereotypical things that would made rock and roll.
Right. I mean, because everybody got tired of it. I mean, you got to understand. I want you to think of the third wave of metal bands circa 1989. Dangerous Toys.
Well, I don't like any of those bands.
Trickster, Slaughter. But a lot of those bands had the same thing. They would all do ballads. The Monster Ballad. Remember the Monster Ballad?
Well, yeah.
Those were all panty droppers, man.
Yep.
That was like, they had a band, they do like their, ain't got, nothing but a good time song. And then came the ballad. The Stadium Full of Lighters song. That is sex right there. I love the ballads.
Well, actually, now that you say that,
that's the first songs I wrote were ballads.
I gotta retract
because I wanted to have sex.
I gotta retract what I kind of said, because it's like, now I think about it, like when it came to those 80s hard rock bands, they're all rocks. They're all sex symbols for chicks still.
Yeah.
So here's an interesting question for you. So you using the 80s, right? Mm-hmm. You have these hard rock bands blatantly singing about fucking chicks,
but dressed like women.
But why don't you think that would have turned off women? Or was that more of a turn on?
Well, at that time, I think it was a different, I wasn't a woman in the 80s, but I think they were a lot more free. And you got to think about the 70s where it was, I don't think women were a lot of fun in the 70s, like early 70s, just everybody's into macrame and, meditating and nothing against it. But I think it was women's rights was a really big, strong thing. And I forgot what documentary I said, but they were talking about women in the early 70s and how you just couldn't get laid. It was just everything sucked, and I don't know what that's like. The 90s were like that. The late 90s for me, that was a drag.
Yeah.
The big pussy drought of 95, I was caught up in that shit. It sucked. Yeah. But it was a very un-rock and roll time, You got Hootie and the Blowfish. Let her cry. The girl you're dating's like, I really like Hootie. Do you like Hootie? It's like, yeah, they're fucking great.
When it comes to music, you got your topics that you can sing about. And probably the most popular thing that's on anyone's mind is going to be sex.
Yeah. So you got to find...
And it's something that you could be passionate about.
Right. And you can...
on both sides.
You can be passionate about it. You can be ridiculous about it. There's a lot of people that have made money doing that. And it's not necessarily sexy, but it's hilarious.
And now that I'm starting to think about this, because one thing I always think about, we always talk about this, like, why did rock and roll die? Why is it dead? And for the most part it is. And maybe the reason why it is kind of dead is that once you take the main elements of rock and roll, the sex and the drugs, and you kind of eliminate them, because, like, let's be honest, I mean, like, you get into the 90s, into the 2000s, it's not really cool to be a druggie, so to speak, and being a rock and roll star.
No, you have to be intelligent.
You
have to be deep.
But back in the 80s...
You have to have a man bun.
Back in the 80s, I mean...
A cinnamon bun.
I mean, you're like... You take bands like Motley Crue or David Lee Roth or anything like that. It's like, yeah! Or like Ozzy with all, all the cocaine. We all love all them because we grew up with them. But if you had someone who came out and trying to be that way now... Yeah. It just doesn't fly. And even
back then, I mean, we... kind of celebrate that idea now, but do you think it would have really been sexy to be you're a young woman and you're backstage at a Motley Crue concert? Would it have really been sexy just to go back there and see Tommy Lee pissing all over himself or whatever the hell, or them vomiting?
Well,
would it have been sexy to see Ozzy snort up ants and Nikki Sixx's piss? I think you would just sit there and go, I've made some different choices, and this isn't what I thought I'd
Well, bringing it back to the rock star thing, it's all about the image.
It is.
It's all about creating that, you're that icon.
Right.
It's all about painting a picture.
Yeah.
And I think maybe what's going on when you're talking about, we talk about like social media and Facebook, where like everything's out in the open.
Yeah. There's no mystery to anything.
I remember like it would be a big deal if like, maybe you'd read an article in a magazine, or maybe there'd be a clip on MTV where maybe they'd be interviewed for like 2 seconds. But now we know everything. So what I'm saying is, like, because of social media, because everyone, everything about everyone, the mystique of rock and roll stars is gone.
It is.
And just like you were saying, like with
you can find out where they live.
Like you were saying, like you're the chick that finally gets to go backstage behind Motley Crue with Motley Crue, and then you go back there and you're like, well, this wasn't what I thought it was.
Well, yeah, everybody, as a sound engineer, everybody always asks. Everybody's got this big idea of what it's like backstage.
So
the reality is, it's just. There's nothing back there except road cases some uneaten dinner and a bunch of just people that look like they're from the Lord of the Rings movies, but they're all in black and they don't want you back there. And they haven't slept in 3 days. That's what backstage is. It's not a party. There's not a champagne room. It's all bullshit. Road cases and half-eaten teriyaki.
So what killed rock and roll? Reality.
I couldn't have said it better, Ray.